Here's a shocking truth that will make you question everything about climate action. The very organization meant to regulate aviation's environmental impact has become a puppet of the industry it's supposed to oversee. A groundbreaking investigation has exposed what many suspected, but few could prove. The United Nations aviation watchdog has fallen under complete industry control, effectively sabotaging efforts to address one of the most polluting sectors on Earth. But here's where it gets controversial. This isn't just bureaucratic incompetence. It's a calculated takeover that's putting profits before our planet's survival. The numbers tell a story that should outrage anyone who cares about climate action. At the most recent Environmental Protection Summit organized by the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. Yes, you read that right. Environmental protection. Industry representatives dominated the room with a staggering 14-to-1 advantage over actual climate scientists and environmental experts. Think about that for a moment. In a meeting supposedly designed to protect our environment, corporate voices drowned out scientific expertise by more than 13 times. This isn't just coincidence. It's corporate capture in its most brazen form. The comprehensive analysis conducted by InfluenceMap, a respected research organization, reveals that ICAO's climate policies have become dangerously weak, shaped primarily by powerful aviation industry players like the International Air Transport Association, IATA, which represents over 350 major airlines worldwide. These aren't neutral observers. They're the very companies whose bottom lines depend on maintaining the status quo. But here's the part most people miss. ICAO operates with a level of secrecy that would make authoritarian regimes jealous. Unlike other United Nations bodies that conduct their business under public scrutiny, ICAO's climate policy development happens behind firmly closed doors. Media representatives are barred from attending, and participants must sign non-disclosure agreements that effectively silence potential whistleblowers. This culture of secrecy creates the perfect breeding ground for industry manipulation, shielding corporate lobbyists from the public accountability they desperately need. And this is the part that should terrify everyone. The result of this corporate stranglehold has been catastrophic for climate action. Independent analysts at Climate Action Tracker have classified international aviation's climate policies as critically insufficient, a technical term that translates to policies aligned with over 4 degrees Celsius of global warming. To put this in perspective, that level of heating would trigger civilizational collapse. We've documented clear evidence of corporate capture, explains Luca Ebank, InfluenceMap's transport policy manager, pulling no punches in his assessment. Industry lobbyists have successfully hijacked decision-making processes at ICAO, leveraging closed-door negotiations to cement their stranglehold on policy. The aviation sector faces an existential climate challenge, yet ICAO desperately needs a complete course correction to address this crisis. Let's talk about some uncomfortable truths that the aviation industry would prefer you didn't know. Flying generates more climate-damaging pollution per mile traveled than any other transportation method available to consumers. Even more disturbing is the extreme inequality driving this crisis. A mere 1% of the world's population accounts for 50% of all aviation emissions. This means the climate crisis is being accelerated by the luxury travel habits of the global elite, while everyone else suffers the consequences. Despite overwhelming scientific evidence demanding immediate emissions cuts, ICAO projects that passenger numbers will double by 2042. Climate Action Tracker's analysis paints an even grimmer picture. Without dramatic policy changes, aviation's carbon dioxide emissions could double or potentially triple by 2050. That's not just missing climate targets. That's actively sabotaging them. Now here's where the industry's narrative becomes particularly controversial. Aviation companies and their trade associations continue promoting a fantasy solution based on more efficient aircraft, sustainable fuels, and ICAO's primary carbon policy, an offsetting scheme that many experts consider fundamentally flawed. The industry wants you to believe these measures can magically control emissions while allowing unlimited growth. But independent climate scientists aren't buying this sales pitch, and neither should you. Multiple peer-reviewed studies conclude that the feasible implementation scale of these proposed solutions remains extremely unlikely to compensate for the massive projected growth in air traffic. The sustainable aviation fuel supply, for instance, won't exist at meaningful scales for years, if ever. Aircraft fuel efficiency improvements have essentially stalled. Most damning of all, ICAO's offsetting scheme called CORSIA has been operational for years, yet hasn't required a single airline to purchase even one carbon credit. Experts describe CORSIA as unambitious and problematic, diplomatic language for completely inadequate. The harsh reality that industry executives don't want to acknowledge is that aviation growth must be significantly curtailed if humanity hopes to meet basic climate survival targets. Airlines and industry associations are deliberately ignoring warning signals, prioritizing short-term industry profits over essential emissions reductions, eBank argues. After years of deliberation, they've produced only weak offsetting policies and non-binding targets that amount to climate theater. When confronted with these damaging allegations, ICAO's response reveals the organization's defensive posture. Their spokesperson claims commitment to increasing transparency as part of a cultural transformation launched in 2022, conveniently timed after years of criticism. They insist that upcoming assembly meetings will review progress and determine next steps, with resolutions supporting implementation of ICAO's long-term strategic plan, envisioning net zero carbon emissions by 2050. But here's what makes their defense particularly hollow. ICAO argues that developing robust technical standards requires detailed industry input and may involve commercially sensitive information subject to confidentiality rules. This reasoning essentially justifies the very secrecy that enables corporate capture, creating a circular logic that protects industry interests while excluding public oversight. The delegation numbers from ICAO's February environmental negotiations expose the full extent of industry dominance. 72 delegates, representing 31% of all participants, came directly from industry trade associations, including employees from fossil fuel giants ExxonMobil and Chevron, plus aircraft manufacturers Airbus and Boeing. Meanwhile, environmental groups managed to secure just 5 delegates, representing a pathetic 2% of total participation. Most remaining delegates theoretically represented national governments, but even this apparent balance proves illusory upon closer examination. 8 of these supposedly independent government representatives were actually employees of aviation or fossil fuel companies, revealing how deeply industry influence penetrates even governmental delegations. Perhaps most shocking of all, one trade association representing aircraft manufacturers deployed 41 delegates, more than any entire national delegation. This means private corporate interests commanded more representation than sovereign nations in discussions about global climate policy. And this is the part that should alarm everyone paying attention. Industry dominance has actually intensified since 2022, when aviation industry delegates outnumbered environmental representatives by only 10-1. The corporate takeover is accelerating, not retreating. ICAO and the international aviation industry have publicly committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. A target that sounds impressive in press releases, but appears increasingly hollow given current trajectories. The International Energy Agency delivered a devastating assessment in January, concluding that aviation remains not on track to meet this supposedly ironclad commitment. But here's where it gets truly controversial. Industry support for even this inadequate 2050 target appears to be crumbling. IATA's head, Willie Walsh, recently called for the target to be re-evaluated, citing airline concerns about rising costs. This represents a stunning admission that when faced with choosing between profits and planetary survival, the industry consistently chooses profits. The aviation industry's track record on climate commitments provides a sobering reality check. they failed to meet 49 out of 50 self-imposed climate targets over the past 2 decades. That's a 98% failure rate that would be laughable if the consequences weren't so catastrophic. Even ICAO's approach to climate funding reveals their priorities. While aviation fuel remains generally untaxed globally and new levies to fund climate action are being discussed at the highest governmental levels, ICAO actively lobbied member states to oppose such proposals at other United Nations bodies. They're not just failing to lead on climate action, they're actively sabotaging it. Criticism of ICAO's climate policies has become so widespread that even industry insiders are speaking out. A group of aviation professionals declared in May that their own industry was failing dramatically in addressing its climate responsibilities. When your own employees start publicly criticizing your climate performance, you know the situation has become desperate. ICAO's offsetting scheme faces particularly harsh criticism from climate experts who understand carbon accounting. Marte van der Graaf from Transport Environment pulls no punches. CORSIA offsets don't actually reduce emissions. They rely heavily on dubious avoided deforestation schemes based on hypothetical predictions that are little better than astrology. That's not just technical criticism. That's calling out fundamental scientific fraud. Even IATA warned recently about a terrifying shortfall of approved offsets after CORSIA's voluntary phase ends in 2027. Inadvertently admitting their flagship climate policy lacks adequate carbon credits to function as advertised. The path forward requires confronting uncomfortable truths about power, influence, and priorities in global climate governance. ICAO must prioritize public interests, science-based policies, and transparent negotiations. Wang concludes. Independent experts and civil society need meaningful seats at the table alongside industry representatives operating in good faith, so the aviation sector can finally accept real responsibility for its climate impact. Here's the question that should spark heated debate in every comment section. Is this corporate capture of climate policy just business as usual, or does it represent a fundamental threat to democratic governance of our planetary crisis? Should we accept that industries get to write their own environmental regulations, or is it time to demand that climate science, not corporate profits, drives policy decisions? Even more controversially, is the aviation industry cannot voluntarily limit its growth to prevent climate catastrophe? Should governments impose mandatory flight rationing or carbon taxes severe enough to force behavioral change? And if ICAO continues prioritizing industry interests over planetary survival, should concerned nations withdraw from this captured organization and create new institutions actually committed to climate action? What do you think? Is this investigation revealing necessary regulatory capture that enables efficient industry input, or exposing a corrupt system that puts profits before planetary survival? The comment section awaits your thoughts on whether we can still trust industry-dominated organizations to address the climate crisis, or if it's time for more radical approaches to climate governance.